morning, and thank you very much to Safnaráðs for inviting me to come and share the experiences from Denmark in terms of research in museums. I apologize that I don't speak Icelandic. I understood a little bit of the former presentation, but unfortunately it's not enough for me to comment on it. I'm here to share our experiences. You then share a bit of your nature with us. This is Ólafur Eliasson exhibition currently on Louisiana. We don't have wonderful nature that you have, so we have to import it and put it into our museums. So I just thought I'd give you a quick overview in terms of the Danish Agency for Culture, where I work, and how it's connected to the Ministry of Culture, and then also a quick overview of the Danish museums. But then I'll go right into business and talk much more about the research in the Danish museums, development over time, the formal framework that we have, and the requirements and recommendations. We also work with something called PhD level, which has been confusing to many. Hopefully it won't be as confusing to you. The assessments that we make of the research in the museums and the challenges we face, and also the steps to come. Well, first of all, as I said, I work in the Agency for Culture. We're part of the Ministry of Culture. The Ministry of Culture has a central division, the Agency for Culture, and we implement the policies and administer much more closely to the cultural institutions than the central division does. The central division is in charge of the more political aspects of culture. We also have an agency for palaces and cultural properties, and all little squares you see on the bottom, those are the state institutions that are part of the Ministry of Culture. In terms of museums in Denmark, we have 301 museums, but out of these only about 105 are either that means state-owned or state-subsidized museums. 7 of them are state museums and 98 are state-subsidized museums. About 2/3 of the state-subsidized museums are within cultural history, and about 1/3 is art history museums, and then you have a handful of natural history museums, not to be forgotten. They're sometimes forgotten in the larger picture. The DNA of an average Danish museum is about 4 venues, maybe 4 different buildings, a main building and other buildings attached to it. An annual turnover of about 2.5 million euro, 23 employees. Out of these, very few will usually be scientific employees, meaning the ones that actually work with and produce research. They're often independent. They can also be owned by municipalities or state-owned, as I said before. An average about 66,000 users, also digital users. Then you have events and programming, which takes part outside the museum, which has about 5,000 attendants. Then about 2,000 objects in the collection, new objects, but we have museums that span from 1 object, a museum, which is also a listed building, to 10 million objects, which we have in the National Museum. But I've been asked to come and talk here today, especially due to research in the Danish museums. And it's also a little story of lifting something to another level and trying to build a platform from where research can be conducted, not just now, but in the future. And much attention here has to be paid to the building blocks that hold up this platform, and we made some experiences with regard to that I will touch upon in my presentation. So development over time in terms of research in Danish museums, generally, and this isn't just the case in Denmark, but also in many other countries, the focus has gone from being on the collections as such to being on connections, to focusing on topics that are of interest to the museum, but maybe don't arise directly from their collection. So instead they have a topic that they want to investigate, and then they start collecting and researching with regard to this. Some of it might, of course, or often should be related to the area of specialty that museum has, but it's also a more broad approach to museum research. Then there are also different research traditions according to the museum types. we have the cultural history and archaeology museums. They are often together. They have had a tradition of publicizing in yearbooks or local and regional history periodicals. Some of them also have published over time, for example, in this Nordisk Museologi that I heard that you were also involved in. And in terms of archaeology, there's a concept which already the director of the National Museum in '79 said there's a rabies amongst the archaeologists. They dig and dig, but they don't publish quite as much as they dig. So that is also the issue today, where you have a lot of excavations and reports being written, but the step from it being an archaeological report to it being termed formal research is missing. Less things are published as research, but you have a lot of reports. In the art museums, the tradition has been a little different. The research that goes on is often reflected in the exhibition catalogues and in monographs that are written, and of course for all of these museums, the research is also reflected in the exhibitions that go on. The natural history museums, some of our natural history museums have ties directly to the universities, and therefore also have employees at the museums that already have one foot in a more universitarian research world, and therefore have already been upskilled in terms of having, for example, a PhD degree with them before they start working in the Natural History Museum. Of course, I'm talking from the formal framework for research from the governmental point of view. We have the museums might view some of this differently, and I'll get back to this later in terms of what the reactions have been in trying to lift and qualify the research in the museums. But you can say that the first building block in the past 10 years of trying to upscale the research is this formal framework that we have. In 2004, Museum Act was passed, and in this we said that there are 5 interrelated tasks in the museums for a state-subsidized museum. You have the collection, registration, conservation, dissemination, and research. And researching in your collections is a prerequisite for being state-subsidized. You must fulfill all these 5 criteria in order to be state approved and therefore state subsidized. And also the dissemination and the educational initiatives in the museums are also research based. And in 2004 there was the Museum Act, but at the same time a more formal way of assessing the museums also came about. We make these quality evaluations or quality assessments, and we have about 10 to 15 quality evaluations that we perform each year, and the more politically skeptical people could say, well, this is just because you want to make sure that your money is used in the proper way. This isn't because you're interested in how the museums develop. But actually, these quality assessments that we do are very much in dialogue with the museums, and the museums sometimes ask us to come and assess them because they can use it as a way of getting into dialogue perhaps with their municipal funders. They can use it, the director can use it also to discuss topics that he would like other people to comment on, and have the employees hear what a view would be from an outsider. So these quality evaluations aren't just the state coming to check up on the museums. They have another aspect within. And when we make these quality evaluations, we look at all the 5 main tasks for the museums. We go and check the storage facilities, we check the finances. Generally it's a 360-degree check of the museum and how it's doing. In relation to our assessments, we have, I'll get back to this one. We have requirements, and we have requirements and recommendations within all the fields that we look at in relation to the assessments. So the requirements for research, and these are, you have to say, they're mandatory. If a museum doesn't live up to all of these, we will write in the report that this is something that they really need to work on, or they might get a grade that isn't quite as good as if they had lived up to these requirements. So first of all, that the museum has a certain professional level, which is pretty obvious, I think, and that they have to conduct research within their area of responsibility. Historically, museums have been put together for many different reasons, and you might have certain museums that have a designated area of responsibility within the law, but they are still very interested on something which is maybe adjacent to but not part of this area, and then if they perform all their research in something which isn't their designated area, we have to say to them, perhaps you should think about fine-tuning your research a little, and then that the museum research is linked to the museum's other tasks. You shouldn't just have silos next to each other, and that the educational department isn't in contact with the research department or vice versa. Then you, of course, through your research, you have to actualize knowledge and make it accessible and relevant to your audience. You have to develop the use and importance of the cultural and natural heritage for the citizens and society in general. And this also leads back to museum research today having a broader scope than just the collection. There's this connection to society in general. How does our collection have a relevance to people today in the society? And last but not least, they also have to ensure that the cultural and natural heritage is there for use in the future, and this is very much in relation also to conservation, of course, and research in conservation. And all of this should happen in collaboration with other state or state-subsidized museums. We've stressed very much that neither the tasks within the museum nor the museums themselves are isolated islands. They should very much work together with each other, also within research. And this especially goes for smaller museums that can really benefit from it. They can benefit from it because then they will be stronger, but they can also perhaps learn from other museums. And then, of course, they have to make their collection and documentation available for research. So those are the requirements that we look at. Then the recommendations that we have, this is something the museums always ask us, yes, but do we have to do this? No, you don't have to, but we recommend, if this is, as I said, the general aim has been to heighten the research in the museums and to build a platform, then we recommend that this is something that you look into. And it doesn't have to happen overnight. When we do these quality assessments, we ask the museum to make a plan of the areas that we have recommendations within, how they are going to work with this, and then we come back a year later and we see how are things going, and then we have another quality assessment maybe 5-6 years later where we of course follow up. In terms of the recommendations, the fact that the museum should have a formulated research strategy, this isn't just something we say within the research area, it's something we say in general to all the tasks, that you should have a formulated strategy. We have some museums, even larger museums, that find that the spirit of the museum is so clear to everybody that nothing needs to be written down on paper. I, as a director, I can just walk through the rooms and people can feel where we're going. And this perhaps isn't always the case, and I don't know, God forbid the director is hit by a car tomorrow, then it might be difficult to know where what is the direction we're taking. So we say, please can you formulate it and make it as accessible, not just for us, but for yourselves. And this is also in a way to help the museum prioritize in terms of the goals that they set for their research, so that it's actually related to the organization that they have and the financial resources. And also to make sure that there's a cost benefit. You might have a very ambitious museum that wants to start long-term research projects, but this will cost a lot of time and money, maybe blood, sweat and tears as well in the end, and what the museum gets out of it at the end of the project might not have been as beneficial as they hoped it would. So it's also looking at a larger perspective. Then also that the research strategy naturally ties in with the overall strategy that the museum has. It shouldn't be something that you just say, oh, you go do research in the corner and I'll talk to you in 5 years. How does this tie in with the plans that the museum otherwise has? Then there's this question of a general research term that we are focusing on, and that's, you can say, building block number 2 in terms of lifting the research level. The general research term, I will get back to it a little later, is the fact that we say there's only one kind of research. You don't have museum research and then you have university research. There's one kind of research, and that is how we look at the publications that are made and the research that's done. Then there's a question of publishing. The museum should publish on a regular basis, and if possible in relevant and peer-reviewed publications and media, both nationally and internationally. And then of course the fact that the museum creates networks also within the research field and has collaborations, which can also be of a strength to the museum in itself, and very interesting projects can arise from this. These, as I said, are recommendations. We don't come to the museums and said, well, you didn't publish in international publications at all the last 4 years, so we're going to take your state funding away from you. That's not the case. But we ask the museums to reflect on it and work towards it, and also try to give them some tools to realize that a lot of good research is already going on in the museums, and perhaps it doesn't need to be altered that much in order for it to be accepted as an article, for example, in a peer-reviewed magazine. Perhaps not just to start off with describing the collection, but finding out what is the research question that I want to deal with here, because already there you're making ties to this general research term. Now, of course, we as a government body, we're not experts on research. So, I mean, I'm sure some of us would say we are, but we're not. So we have a central division that has a research council, and you have the Agency for Culture that has expert panels. And they are the ones, when we do the quality assessments, the museums send us a list of the publications that they've made the last 4 years. And these lists are then sent to a panel of experts that go through it and evaluate what type of research are we dealing with here, or is this more dissemination than it's actual research. We have expert panels within art history, cultural history, archaeology and natural history. So you have, and it's a kind of a peer review process, you can call it. They don't just send the list, they send the publications, so they read them and review them. These expert panels are also ones that have been giving out funding for research projects that aren't part of the legally designated tasks in the museum. As I said before, you have to do research as part of the 5 main tasks to be state subsidized, but there's extra funding to be had that you can apply for projects. You can also apply for PhD scholarships for employees in the museums. Now, there's a research council in the central division, and the reason I'm showing this now is because a lot of confusion happened later on when the funding between these two was altered. The research council, they also gave out money. They gave out money to the state organizations under the Ministry of Culture, who are by law obliged to do research at a higher level than the museums are today. Then you have the Agency for Culture, where you have the expert panels that then once a year receive applications for research projects in the museums and PhD applications. This is how it was. Then we had the 2009, the Ministry for Culture decided we need to have a research strategy for ourselves. This is kind of the second building block of the platform we're trying to build. First of all, you have the 5 interrelated tasks, and you have the quality evaluations, and now we came with a research strategy. The reason for the research strategy was to say the museums and the research need to be able to compete internationally. There also has to be a consistency in the research performed in the museums. So they chose to work with this term called general research that's composed of, it's related to OECD. They have a definition of research in universities, and the working group decided to partly use that definition and have the aspects of validity, originality and transparency to be the factors that comprise this general research term. This is also how university research, these three aspects, also part of them. You have to show that you have a valid research question. You are going to use theories and methods that are relevant to the research question, also how you place yourself within the field of the research that's going on. That's basically what this general research term covers. It's also opposed to research within a specific genre, because some of the museums would say, but museum research is one thing and university research is another, and we don't want to be put into the same boat because we don't think we can be evaluated under the same conditions. Another aspect of the cultural research strategy from 2009 was the dissemination of the research, because it's fantastic if research goes on, but if nobody knows what's been written, who is to enjoy and the fruit of this labor. So the universities in Denmark use the system called PURE, where they register the research that goes on. Now, we have asked the state museums to use this PURE research, the PURE system to record their research in, but it's not something that the museums actually are using quite yet. It's a good way to make your research accessible to an international group of people as well that are also connected to PURE. You can upload your CV, your publications, other talks, conferences that you've been part of, and it's a way to disseminate much more and make clear what's been going on in the museums. Then there's the aspect of thinking about research strategically and in a long-term perspective. I also mentioned that earlier, that it's not just about the research that's going on today, it's about how can funding be obtained for the research in the long run. And if museums are supposed to compete with other organizations within the arts, not just organizations but also research within the arts, then they need to be able to show what research they're conducting and how this contributes to the research community. Then a professional advice center on research was set up at the National Museum. This meant that the museums could contact the advice center and ask them, or say, we want to write an application either to one of the expert panels in the Agency for Culture or for an international foundation. How do we go about this? What can we do? Could you look at my application, and so on? Because writing applications for funding is a tedious process and it requires quite a lot of work. So it's nice to have someone look through the project description and the CVs and so on and see if it lives up to standard. The advice center also send out a newsletter once in a while telling people what's going on in terms of research in museums, are there any funds made available at the moment, and so on. The last part of the Ministry for Culture's research strategy, or one of the focus points, was the education for researchers. There used to be specific PhD schools and courses for researchers within cultural institutions. This has now been closed down, and they take part in the research courses and PhD courses that go on at university. But it was initially the idea because they felt it was important that there were certain areas within the cultural sector that needed to be shed light on, and so they need their own courses and shouldn't just take part in the university courses. The third the third building block of lifting the level of the museum research. This was when it was getting a little wobbly. I mean, make sure that your blocks are the same height when you start building, because otherwise it gets a little tricky. In 2013, a new Museum Act was put into action in Denmark, and in terms of research, the deal breaker there was we're saying that all financial support for research and institutions under the Ministry of Culture, that means that all the museums, should be given out by the Research Council under the Ministry of Culture. As I showed you before, there was the Agency for Culture and there's the Central Division, and the Central Division is the one that's in charge of the Research Council. And the Research Council has says that it's mandatory that applicants have a PhD degree or a research production which equates this, something we call PhD level. This led to a lot of confusion. First of all, the museums thought, if we don't have a PhD at our museum, does that mean all our funding is being taken away from us? How are we as a small museum ever supposed to have a PhD? How can we get to PhD level? Does this mean that I can also call myself a PhD when I leave this building? There were a lot of questions and a lot of confusion. The reason for this this demand is because the money given out by the Research Council in Denmark is part of the larger funding system under the government, and all funding that's given to research there has to be given to research that takes place at a certain level, and therefore they say it has to be PhD level. It is the taxpayers' money that's given to this, and so they want to ensure that it's actually given to research that at least officially can be said is of a certain quality and level. I'm not saying in any way that you can't do research if you don't have a PhD, but this is like a formal requirement. So this led to a lot of confusion amongst the museums. PhD level, what and how, and so we knew this was going to lead to confusion. So we decided we couldn't just say to all the museums, well, from tomorrow you have to apply for your funding for research from the Research Council, because we made a survey and 43 of the museums didn't have anybody at PhD level, and we couldn't leave them out in the dark, and the politicians were very much aware of this as well. So an extra agreement was made, a political agreement, that we have to have a transition period where we can help lift the level of the scientific employees in the museums, to see that every museum has somebody who is at least at PhD level. Now, how do you do this? In the universities, you can apply to become a PhD student, and sometimes you can also write a thesis at home and you can send it into university, and then it can be evaluated and they can say it's at PhD level. The problem is we have quite a few universities, we have even more museums. How is this going to function? So what we decided to do was we put together a working group with the umbrella organization for the Danish universities. All universities are part of this organization. And we developed a model where we have a mix of university researchers and museum employees that sit and evaluate the publications that scientific employees send in. So you have employees that perhaps have been working 20 years in the museum. They're not formally PhDs, but actually the publications that they have behind them can be said to equate to somebody who's gone through PhD studies, what they are expected to produce. And we say this is something like 5 to 7 articles or 1 to 2 monographs. So we made this model, making sure that it wasn't just university employees looking at it, because that was one of the objections that have been raised. How can university researchers evaluate museum research? We had to make sure there was a mix. So we have both museum employees and researchers that then evaluate these publications. We also have a fixed fee, because universities, as many other organizations and also businesses and would like to make money. So if you go to university and say, could you please put together a panel that evaluates my research, they will say that's fine, but this costs 70,000 krona here, and another university will say it costs 85. And so we thought, okay, to make it easier for the museums, we make a fixed fee. All research that the museums are interested in seeing if it can be called PhD level goes through these panels that have been set up, and there's a fixed fee. The museums don't pay for it, the Ministry of Culture is paying for it, and then that way we are trying to ease this transitional period for the museums. And we did a pilot project where we had somebody from art history, cultural history and archaeology send in their publications, and we tested it out. We tested it out on the panels, and we said, is this the right thing we're looking at? And some of them said, oh no, but they don't live up to the requirements of having taken courses at university to be a PhD. And we said that doesn't matter, we're looking merely at the publications that have been made. So after adjusting this, now we've implemented these expert panels, and the museums are now applying to have their employees evaluated to see if they're at PhD level. Now this only relates to the fact that they can apply for money from the Research Council under the Ministry of Culture. We're not taking any of the funding away otherwise, but it's also a general way of getting the museums to look at their research, or talking to their employees and finding out. You ask an employee, what would you like to do? And many of them say, oh, I want to do a PhD, of course. Well, but some directors of museums have said, well, I'm very happy you would like to do a PhD, but I don't think you'll be happy doing a PhD. I think that which aspects of the PhD are you interested in? Could we find another way for you to do these tasks in the museum without having to go an actual 3-year PhD study? So it's also a way of getting the museum directors to prioritize and think about really where do they strategically want to go with their research, and who's supposed to lift it within the museum. As I said, the confusion was quite real, and all hell broke loose in 2013 from the side of the museums. We thought it was an excellent idea. We were doing everything we could to try and ease everybody along, but that building block was not very stable. You had the Danish Museums Association saying good research can be produced even if you don't have a PhD. Why do we need to have a PhD? You have directors from art museums saying the criteria for research, they're too dogmatic, they can't be honored by smaller local museums because their publications are aimed at the public and for educational purposes. So what's this with? Actually, it's quite interesting because this museum this year has received a very large research grant, so now I think they're all right with it. But this was in 2013. Some museums said, well, if we thought more strategically, yes, maybe we've done a collaboration with university, but we want to be free and don't want to compromise in the area that we're researching, so we prefer to do it by ourselves. Then there were people there, already PhDs in many museums, and one of them said, well, I become a better researcher, but I remove myself from the other activities in the museums by doing my research. So that was another objection to be heard. And generally, you had this museum research is its own category, and the museums need more time for research in general. So those were kind of some of the objections that came about. We also very much from the art museums had an issue because in Denmark there was a degree at university that could be taken until 97 called Art, and at that it's between a master's degree and a PhD. But at the time they were told this is a research degree, and a lot of the curators at the art museums, they have this Art. So they said, but why do we have to be PhD level because we already have a research degree? And that has also been something we've had to work with and tell them that at the time it was a research degree. It's now been replaced by PhD, and the PhD level is what we have to work from today. But many of those people with degree can get the PhD level stamp quite easily because they have a long production behind them. And sometimes it's just a question of taking maybe the catalogues that they've written for exhibitions and twisting them a little and sending them into a peer-reviewed publication. Luckily, in 2014, the storm blew over. I mean, I can say that in 2013, I was at the Danish Museum Association's yearly meeting, and I was about to hide under the table because the Ministry of Culture, we were not just evil, we were worse than evil, and how could we do this? It was there was quite an antagonistic atmosphere there. But the storm blew over, and in 2014 at the Museum Association's meeting, they had actually decided that research in museums was going to be one of their focus areas, and they thought that the way that we were working with it now was fruitful for the museums. As the storm blew over, there were many articles written, and one of them, a director of a cultural history museum in Esbjerg, said, well, the high-level research also ensures a high level of dissemination. It has a trickle-down effect. If you heighten the area, one of the tasks in the museum, especially within research dissemination, is going to affect the other. Then you have the member of the Innovation Council, which is one of the councils where the arts in general can apply for funding, for larger funding projects. And they also said there's a tendency that applications for museums are less sophisticated. So by ensuring that you are heightening the level of research in museums, that perhaps also means that these applications will become better and the museums have a greater chance of competing and actually receiving funding. And today the case is actually that we're receiving applications at the Agency for Culture for people who are preparing PhD applications. They want to take a couple of months off to prepare this properly because they've understood that a lot of work actually has to go into it, and they want to sharpen the applications. Then there's a senior researcher from another museum, also in Esbjerg, but it's a different one, who said, it might seem frightening and confusing, but not everybody expects you to be a PhD by tomorrow. It has to be thought through as a part of a long-term strategy where employees are gradually upskilled. And I think this was one of the things that also made the museums calm down a little and understand that it's not something we're asking of you tomorrow, and if you don't show up with 3 PhDs tomorrow, then there's no funding. That's not the case. And last of all, as I said, the Museum Association, they declared that research was one of their focus areas in the years to come. And the Museum Association, they've actually set down their own little council that deals with research, and we made a joint conference with them this summer, the Ministry or the Agency for Culture, where we talked about research in Danish museums, and I was also explaining this PhD level once again to the museums and calming them down. So we actually have quite a good collaboration going on there, and I think one of the reasons there was a storm also when the new Museum Act came about was because there were a lot of other issues in this new Museum Act that they felt hadn't been discussed properly with the Museum Association, and therefore they were kind of already on the warpath, and then PhD level was a good target to jump on. So in terms of assessment today, we still have our quality evaluations. Today the museums themselves they don't have to send in their publications anymore, they just have to send a list of their publications and write themselves if publications have been peer reviewed or not. I presume most of you are familiar with the term peer review, but it basically means that someone who is not from your own museum reads the article through, or not just from museum, it could also be the university or someone else who is a peer, reads the article and says that this has a level to be accepted as a form of research and is therefore peer reviewed. There are different levels of peer review. I mean, if you want to do it the extremely proper way, then you have to have double blind, so the person who's reading doesn't know who wrote the article, the person whose article is being read doesn't know who's evaluating it. But in terms of the museums at the moment, we're rather large in this, and we don't think that it has to be quite as strict. We just say it's important that you have peers reading this who are not from your museum. And there's also something called the bibliometric research indicator. And this is something that, in a way, we don't want to be part of it. On another hand, it's nice for us that it exists. It has to do with the way the universities are funded today. You have this research indicator, where the researchers at universities then tell which research that they've done, and this gives them a number of points. And according to the number of points that a university has, then they're given funding. Now, this isn't something that we from the Agency for Culture are at all interested in getting into. We don't want museums to be funded in terms of how much research is produced and what level of research it is. But they have these authority lists where they have either publishing houses or publications that are on these lists. And if you have written in one of these lists, that means that by university standards, this is research, what's in the publication. And that means if museums have written to one of these publications or within these publishing houses, then we can also say that it is research. Thank you. So today you have the Research Council in the end, the Research Council is going to be giving out all the money to the museums, but they can only do this when the museums have the PhD level. So we have this transition period of 3 years. We're going to, every year we evaluate and see how many museums have then actually upskilled themselves and gotten to PhD level. This year, let me see, approximately 10 museums have been upskilled. And it's a 3-year transition period. We have a statistics every year that we gather from museums called Danish Museum in Numbers, and museums themselves, they report how many researchers do they have, and we of course look at this. And if in 2 years we see that there's still a large number of museums that don't have any employees at PhD level, then we're not just going to cut off this possibility for extra funding for research projects. But on the other hand, there's some museums that say, well, we do the research that we do now into our collections. We will try to work with the general research time, but we are just not very interested in doing other research projects. That's completely fine by us if that's what they want to. The other thing is the possibility to do more research and maybe larger research projects. And then in the Agency for Culture, we have these expert panels that still evaluate the applications that come in from museums that don't have PhD level, and the research evaluations for this PhD level. Now, there's still some challenges. This isn't something that's been completely solved, and there are many discussions still going on, and how do you define research and which kind of research are we talking about? And there's also artistic development, like you have in the conservatories. Is this also, can you call this research when you're painting a picture and saying this is research? So this is something that's ongoing. It's not something that's been solved. But the actual challenges right now are mainly related to the peer-reviewed publications, because there aren't that many of them that the museums feel are accessible to them. At this conference this summer, we had a representative from peer-reviewed publications within different areas telling the museums very concretely what do you have to do if you want to send an article to us. These are the steps to be taken, because we feel it's important to give as much support as possible to the museum, so this is actually so it feels it's something that's reachable for them. Some of them also say we have a lack of qualifications to write articles. It's been quite a while since we went to university, and now suddenly we have to write articles with research questions. How do we do it? And we're also working with the Danish Museums Association to offer courses on how to write research articles. This is something, if you're doing a PhD, you also take courses on how to write research articles. Then there's a lack of access. If you're at university, you have access to all the electronic publications there are, but if you're in a museum, you often don't. And it costs a lot of money, so you have to pay every article you want to read. And if you want to be part of this research level, and you have to have validity and so on, you also need to know what state of the art it is at the moment within the field that you're researching. So we are also, luckily, the organization that's responsible for selling these licenses in Denmark is on the second floor of the building where I work. So we're trying to make some kind of arrangement where we say, okay, can we have a package, or can at the moment it's the natural history museums, they will point to the 20 most important publications for them to have access to. Can we bundle that together and give us a fixed price so the individual museum doesn't have to go and pay every time they're reading an article? And after this, with natural history museums, we'll then work with the other areas of the museums. Of course, it's always nice to know somebody who works at university. You can steal their password and then you can get into it that way, but it's not completely legal. Then there's the issue of PhD inflation. First of all, you have to make sure to realize the difference between the fact that this PhD level does not entitle you to be a PhD or call yourself a PhD. It just means you can apply for this funding from the state. But the universities have also been worried, are we producing too many PhDs now, and museums will only hire people that have a PhD level. You can say that there's a generational change taking place now. A lot of people being employed in museums in Denmark now have PhDs, but of course not all should, and it also depends which area in the museum you're working with. But this is very much up also to the individual museum, the director, decide which way do I want to go, how do I want to prioritize my resources. Then employees change jobs. We said we want to have one person in each museum at PhD level, and in 2 years that person gets a new job, and then you have a museum with no PhD level. Then what do you do? So this is an ongoing process and something that we're working on continuously. And then there's also the question of being geographically challenged. I mean, I'm in Iceland, so maybe I shouldn't say that we're geographically challenged, but there are also parts of Denmark where people just don't want to go and work. You have museums in areas that are quite far away, and they say, well, we can't attract anybody with a PhD to come and work here. What do you do? So these are challenges that we are constantly working on. So just very quickly, what's next? Well, the upskilling of the museums has already begun. We had the Research Council. This year was the first year when all the museums with PhD level could apply. There were 34 applicants, which is quite high considering we only have about 100 museums, and out of these about 15 received funding from the Research Council. So they were good applications. And it's the 3-year transition period. Then it's quite interesting, we have a fund or a foundation called Velux. They're the ones that produce the thermal windows. I don't know if you've heard of them. Anyway, they have quite a lot of money, and they have made a call for projects that strengthen the relationship between museums, universities and dissemination, because they find that this is an area that needs to be strengthened, and also the bond between the universities and the museums. And they're funding quite large projects. So it will be interesting to see what comes out of that. And then the New Carlsberg Foundation, which also they have to do with beer originally. They also have quite a lot of money. They have put out a call for postdocs in art museums, also showing that there's a movement of trying to upskill people in the museums, and the foundations are also on that wave, you can say. So the lesson learned from the experience we've had in Denmark is it's not where you are today, but it's where you want to be, maybe in 5 years, maybe in 10 years, and how you get there, that's important. It's the building blocks that you use in terms of lifting this level of research, and also very much saying at the same time that the research is already going on, and the research is going on is also good, but this is to be seen in a larger context. It's to be seen in terms of how we can compete with other sectors in terms of funding, and it's in terms of seeing how can we compete internationally as well. So it's not just about today or tomorrow, it's about 5 or 10 years. Yep, that's what I had to say. So,
okay,
yeah.
Well, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Okay. We have maybe time for 1 or 2 questions before we go to a short break. And I'm pretty sure that
Just very short, thanks. It's very interesting.
You're welcome.
What's the budget for the agency? How many people are working with, and what is their expertise?
Oh, and the Agency for Culture? Yes. We are about 300 employees in the agency. We were comprised, it was a merger between libraries, museums, libraries, cultural heritage, and the Arts Council, and we merged in 2012. So we're about 300 people, and our budget, I will just see, I think it's, I have it.
They all have PhDs.
In the Agency for Culture?
Yeah.
No, not at all. Far from it. You can say that right now there's the possibility of doing PhDs in collaborations with organizations and not just with universities. So the Agency for Culture has a few PhDs that are started as co-funded by the agency, by a university. But no, we don't have PhDs at all. And it's not because we think that everybody should have a PhD, but it's in the larger picture of the funding from the state that they want to ensure that it's given to this research at a certain level. Yes. I wouldn't mind having a PhD. Yes. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
Thank you, Sophie. I'm sorry that you didn't understand my presentation, because I think the two, when you put them together, I think they create interesting questions to ask, specifically on the bureaucratic level. And what I take from your presentation and from the difference to the Icelandic condition is that, I mean, we have the same recommendations by the law and the overall administration, but the difference is that there's no follow-up by the ministry. There's no follow-up by the funders, by the Ministry of Culture, what research I did. And I think this is a great opportunity for museums in Iceland to be able to define their own interest in research before having a top-down kind of an approach. Like what I take from your presentation is the case in Denmark, which also creates a lot of problems. But I think there are opportunities in the local scene. While I mean, the law and the administration says that the accreditation by the Museum Council says that museums have to do research, but there's no one that's telling museums how to do it or by what means. So I think this is the biggest difference between yours and ours, and I think we could learn a lot from your process.
Yes, absolutely.
Could I maybe remind you that before you answer, that at the end of the day we will have a session where we can talk about presentations like Sophie's presentations, and we don't have more time for more questions, or even for your reflection or response to Olaf's comments. But I'm pretty sure that all of you are wondering, what PhD stands for. Someone told me that it's a degree in plumbing, heating, and training. But I think that we should go for a short break and be here around 11.
Yeah. Can I just very quick, because I actually unfortunately have to go back to Denmark, so I won't be here this afternoon. So if you have any questions, you can catch me in the break. Also, or otherwise, you're very welcome to contact me, and you have my information here. Otherwise, Augusta has it.
Okay, thank you.